I couldn't bring myself to ask to borrow the shotgun because it meant doing the impossible, admitting to my family that I was afraid. Instead, I focused on what I considered to be a more immediate solution. I would simply stop being afraid. I continued to walk to work. When the restaurant kept me late, I would ask one of the other servers to walk with me, but only to the end of the street. I insisted on traversing the final block alone. I volunteered to house sit for people who lived miles into the woods, sometimes without cell service. One particular house was owned by a woman with two Scotty dogs and a cockatoo. All night, the dogs barked at forms only they could see in the black windows, and the cockatoo talked to itself in a high whine across the hall. I spent the week tiptoeing through the house, scarcely breathing after dark, trying to become the silence I wished to hear. I didn't sleep. Yet when I handed the owner her keys at the end of the week, I felt as though I had overcome something, if only my own instincts. That is an excerpt from an autobiographical essay by Rachael Greene featured in the Columbia Journal. Rachael is a nonfiction writer from Southern Appalachia with an MFA from Queen's University of Charlotte. She has written about the ethics of borrowing from your own life in your writing for the Master's Review, and her essay, Flesh Record, won first place in the 2022 Blue Mesa Review Summer Contest for Nonfiction. She also has work in Another Chicago Magazine and Mulberry Literary. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Rachael, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, tell me a little bit about where you're from and how that place has meant something in your writing, but also in like American literature in general.
Yeah, I'm from Southern Appalachia or Northeast Georgia, depending on how you look at it, but kind of the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And it's a region that has a really fraught history, and also a lot of beautiful culture in it as well. It's a place of a lot of contradictions. Um, and yeah, I see this kind of wave of Appalachian literature in recent years. And it's existed much longer than in recent years. I mean, Bell Hooks was from Appalachia, X. Walker, Silas House, Lee Smith. There's tons of writers from the region, but especially since J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy was released as a book and then made into a film, there has been kind of this reinvigoration of literature coming out of this region, and writers have been kind of rallying around this idea of bringing more perspectives out of the region than just this one perspective that many of us disagree with and don't think is a fair rendition of the place that we're from. So yeah, place plays a big role in my writing. I'm from the mountains. I lived there most of my life. I lived abroad after that, and then I have since returned. So it's a kind of a boomerang effect in my own life, and it definitely has been so in my writing as well.
What is that kind of bad version or the contested version?
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of the narrow identity around what it means to be from Appalachia, and from the South. For the part of Appalachia that I'm from, Southern Appalachia, there's kind of this dual uh, idea of what it is to be Southern, and then also what it is to be kind of from the mountains, to be a hillbilly, to be um, not educated. There's a lot of really narrow-minded perspectives around what it means, typically white. And most of these are incorrect assumptions. There is a lot of diversity in Appalachia. Nima Avashia wrote a book called Another Appalachia, talking all about the Indian culture in Appalachia, and her family specifically Frank X. Walker, Frank X. Walker and Bell Hooks give a completely different African American perspective from Appalachia. So yeah, the narrow-mindedness of what it means to be from a place and what people in that place look like and believe. And there was a lot of kind of scapegoating during the 2016 election, kind of blaming this region for the outcome of that election. And, there are tons of studies and books that talk about, breaking it down on a county by county basis and just how much diversity and difference of opinion there was in the region. But nationally, we kind of get this picture that everyone in Appalachia voted for Trump, and that just simply isn't true. There's so much more nuance and diversity to this region than most people know about or hear about. And unfortunately, it's because books like Hillbilly Elegy and, this kind of perpetual identity is being thrown into the media and into the news on a regular basis. And it's much easier to just pick that up and assume that than to read some of the other literature that's out there from the region.
One thing as someone who's left home and come back and called a lot of different places home, I'm always fascinated by the phenomenon of what leaving teaches you about the place you're from. Um, was there anything that was really like captured your attention in a new way after you spent some time traveling?
Yeah, kind of the ways in which those assumptions that I just talked about had actually been internalized by myself and by the people in my life that also left. And some of us came back and some of us didn't. Um, but leaving and living in other places in other parts of the world and kind of seeing other cultures makes you realize that this level of complexity and I don't want to say self-loathing, but this kind of everyone kind of feels that pull to go somewhere else, to experience something outside of where they're from and kind of be frustrated with the limiting identity of being from a certain place. Um, but then for me, at least, when I left it and I tried really hard, I erased my accent. I absolutely did everything I could to leave this place behind and not in my identity. The more I did that, the less at peace I felt internally. Like there was a dissonance in my identity. And especially when I started writing more, it was unavoidable. I mean, where I grew up, where I was raised, was so integral to the stories that I was telling that I couldn't erase it. And that was a really painful growing process to kind of work through, and a lot of versions and drafts of things that will never see the light of day because they're written in this voice that isn't me. That's me trying to be a version of me that isn't from a place that I simply am a part of. Um, so yeah, leaving kind of it's like zooming out in a way. It kind of gives you that perspective to say, this place that I'm from is not perfect, but nowhere is. And it's so integral to who I am. I can either reject it and kind of live with this rejection of a part of myself, or I can, be a part of it and represent it in a new way and actually be part of some kind of change or, you know, have pride in the parts of it that don't need changing too. Because I think there's a lot to be proud of in the South and in Appalachia. And there are parts of it that still need to change, but both of those things can exist at the same time. And I think that that's something when we're younger, we tend to just throw out the baby with the bathwater, and be like, well, I don't identify with this place anymore. I'm just going to be done with it. And that's a really naive way to approach what is really important and really huge to your identity, especially as a writer. Place is so integral to everything that you write. So yeah. As someone who has lived abroad and lived in many different places, I know that that's something that you could speak on as well.
Oh yeah, and code switching. I'll have someone from Boston on here at some point, and I'll drop my R's and start uh
Yeah.
talking different. But no, it's true, and I guess you're describing really a process of coming home through writing.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, is there a moment you can point to that made you a writer, so to speak, or was it gradual, or was it something that you've been doing as long as you can remember?
It's kind of all of those things. So I'm a prolific journaler. I always have been since my first journal is when I was 6 years old. Um, and I'm writing in it about the kind of farm that we lived on and the animals and all of those things. And I have accumulated hundreds of journals in my lifespan up till this point. Um, and hit a point a few years ago where I actually had to throw some of them away because it was just unrealistic to carry that many of them around with me. But in that way, writing has always been like part of who I am. But I never considered myself a writer. Even in college, I dated someone who was writing was such a passion and he considered it to be, his number one thing. He is a writer. And I always thought, I don't feel that way about this, so I'm not a writer. Um, and I felt that way up until I went back to get my MFA, to get my master's degree. Um, I never considered myself a writer until I got a degree in it. And I think that that is a costly way to go about discovering that you are something, that you are a writer. But for me, it was necessary. It was necessary to have kind of that validation. And that's something that the program director at Queen's University of Charlotte, Fred Lebron, said in my very first conversation with him was our number one job here is to convince you that you are a writer. And that was very much the case for me. And it still is. I go through, dry spells where career is the main focus for me and my writing kind of takes a back seat. And I feel like during those moments, oh, I'm not a writer. But the truth is that we are writers throughout our lifespan. Even in the moments when we're not actively writing something, we're still in process. There's still a process going on that will play out later on the page. So there wasn't necessarily a moment for me, but it took me getting my MFA for me to actually kind of come into that identity and say, yeah, I am a writer. And I maybe fought this for the first 30 years of my life, but now I can actually, say I am a writer. Yeah.
So I have a question about MFAs, and it's kind of
Mm.
a two-part question. Um, I've had a couple people on to talk about coming from just totally non-liberal arts backgrounds, and all of that. And I'm somewhere in the middle where I have an English degree, but I didn't go any further than that. Um, what, in your opinion, is the best argument for getting an MFA and the best argument against getting an MFA?
That's a really good question, because I hold kind of a split view on this, and I think there's a good argument for both sides of that. So I think a good argument for getting your MFA is if you're in a situation like me where you really do need that craft training and that I don't want to say confidence boost, but something to kind of bolster your confidence in that career and in that kind of an into that world of writing. Because I think, a lot of, for me at least, out of college, I jumped straight into my career, which was so far away from this kind of writing world that approaching it felt really daunting. So for me, the MFA was the most direct line into this world and into this realm, and also was the thing that I needed to make me feel like a writer. So I would say for someone that really wants to hone their craft, that really needs that kind of, I have the piece of paper that says that I am this thing, it's important and it's worth every penny if that's you. And the flip side of that, I do not think an MFA makes you a writer. I think there are many people that hold MFAs who are not good writers. um, I don't mean to sound cruel in that, but I think that some people approach an MFA with a very different intention and maybe discover in the course of the MFA, this wasn't exactly what I was after. And then in that case, that's a very costly way to go down a path and then determine that you needed to go in a different direction. Um, and there are so many other ways to get into the world of writing. Um, if you can harness that identity, that idea that if you write, you're a writer, the MFA is just a piece of paper at the end of the day. So if you can harness that, there are so many workshops, there are so many outlets online. If you want to learn about a specific craft or a specific approach, you can go study under a lot of the writers that have, published in an area that you're interested in being a part of. There's so many other ways, there's so many other avenues. The MFA is just one of them. So that would be my argument against an MFA is if it feels like something that you need to do just to say that you did it, there might be other ways for you to kind of get into the world of writing than going through this long and arduous process. Yeah.
Shifting gears to the, I guess, craft or the way you think about craft. Um, and I put a note here to just ask you about imagination and memory. And it was this very Nabokov sounding
Yeah.
concept, but how does that work? How does imagination shape our memories and vice versa? Or is that even the right question?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there are so many things here in this topic that we could spend an entire hour just talking about this. But I think for nonfiction writers and memoirists, especially, the suggestion of imagination being a part of our craft can be really rattling because we're supposed to be the keepers of truth and the writers of what actually happened and we're documenting the real experiences. But the reality is that imagination plays into our memory. And I was reading, so this kind of came out of a conversation that you and I were having where I had just read this essay by Sigrid Nunez in the 2023 Best American Essays, and I think it originally appeared somewhere else, but she's a fiction writer, but one of her novels is very heavily autobiographical, and she was talking about when she would give readings from that book, the segments that were based in real experiences uh, were the easiest for her to read. And then when she would read segments that were purely fictional or that were kind of elaborated outside of the real experiences, she often found herself getting emotional and had a harder time reading those segments because they were more powerful to her. And she talked to another writer about this, and he made the statement that imagination is more powerful than memory. And my kind of twist on that is that I think imagination is the strongest form of memory because for us to remember anything, we are reimagining it through a lens of however many years or days or weeks since it happened. And we're reconstructing a scene, we're reconstructing something in our imaginations. So we are kind of, in a way, reimagining a real event and remembering how it made us feel. And our imagination is kind of extrapolating on this emotion that kind of came out of that event. So in that way, that really resonated with me, especially with this piece that I have coming up that you read an excerpt of. She mentions this in the essay too, that a lot of writers, and this is very true for me, can't write about real experiences until enough time has passed that we've forgotten most of it. And that's another thing that I don't think nonfiction writers like to admit because we want, again, to kind of say we are the authority here and we can only write about things that we know happened. But the reality is that there's a lot of remembering and there's a lot of work that goes into remembering things accurately. And there's many writers have different approaches to this, but for me, the processing of a real event takes time. And in that processing, my brain reconstructs the event in multiple ways. And that's the kind of aggregate of all of those different varieties of a scene are what make it into the work. Now, details are important, accuracy is important. That's not to say that, the time and place and those details remain the same, but the emotion that we're reconstructing as nonfiction writers can change because of the perspective that we have on it, given the amount of time that we have away from something. Um, so yeah, I hope that makes sense. I could go on many rabbit trails about this one.
No, as could I. And I was just it's timely because I'm rereading Hiroshima by John Hersey, which is kind of the original. In if it wasn't for that slim little 100-page, essentially New Yorker article, there's no Truman Capote, there's no Joan Didion, there's no Perfect Storm, and it's it's something. I remember one time I was working on a memoir, like I was ghostwriting a memoir, and someone said something about, well, you can always just make up parts of it. I'm like, no, 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 no. That's not what using the techniques of narrative and the novel or whatever means. But I think I don't know, and I hope that we start to see a return to that. I think that ideas, and in part because people are really afraid of not having the right ideas these days. I think ideas have had this hegemony that has really harmed nonfiction in the last 10, 15 years. John Hersey doesn't have anything to say in the main narrative about the dehumanization of the Japanese that sort of enabled American attitudes around Hiroshima. He shows scenes that are depicting dehumanization, and it is so much stronger than a treatise you could have about brutality or something.
Yeah, I think that point that you just made about storytelling, I think that's the heart of it for all genres, is that the most powerful way to convey what we want to convey the most is not to state it plainly, but to portray it through a scene or through, in poetry, like the most crystallized version of the language, or, all of these different ways that we do it in different genres, but none of them are just stating the thing. Because as humans, we're not wired that way. Storytelling has been a part of our identity and the ways that we learned since, we were evolving. That's how we shared cautionary tales and how we built culture, and all of it was through storytelling. So much of the mythology that survives from, ancient times, it's all stories. And we have so many questions about, well, what did they believe and how did it impact these, very straightforward, that's not how they thought. And in a lot of the same ways, we don't think that way either, even though we like to think we're very logical, and we would much rather read the treatise about, why Americans have these views and just read it plainly. It's not the case. That's not what's going to move us. That's not what's going to make it linger with us and actually create empathy for people. Yeah.
On the subject of ethics, and this is something you've written about, there's always that issue for a memoir writer of mining your own life for these gems and details, and in some cases like airing dirty laundry. What do you think is fair game, and how would you suggest that somebody like navigates that question for themselves?
Yeah. I think everything is fair game, first of all. The caveat being that you have to decide what you are willing to live with. If you write about something, there will be implications in your real life. And our job as writers and artists is to decide, is this thing important enough or more important than me and the waves that it could potentially make in my life? Or in this instance, do I need to hold off on this thing because it's not actually worth the upheaval that it could create? And I write a lot about this. That's kind of the very boiled down version of what I think it comes down to. Um, and Alexander Chi, he wrote How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, amongst many other wonderful novels and essays. Uh, he summarizes this in a much more eloquent way, which I think I've butchered here, but I quote him in the essay that I wrote about this in the Master's Review. But he has this kind of idea of universal truths and how as fiction and nonfiction writers, we're getting at these universal truths. And if the thing that we're writing about is getting closer to that universal truth, it means that it is more important than you, the writer, and the waves that it could make in your life, essentially. Um, but we're still humans with relationships in our lives that we don't want to damage. And I think there's some very practical steps that people can take to mitigate some of that. Um, One of the things I advocate for the most is really fiercely protecting the generative space, that first draft writing. You should not be carrying the voices of your mom or your friend into the room with you, these imagined reactions of what people might feel towards your work. You need to close the door and leave them outside and then write the story, write the thing. And another thing that I recommend is, I have a policy of I don't share first drafts. And I think everyone should have that policy because that's part of that kind of defense of that generative space. Your first draft is between you and the page. That is it. And that allows the story to really kind of come out and show you what it wants to be. Because sometimes the story that we go in to write ends up not being the story that needs to be told. And sometimes that's upsetting even to us as writers. And, kind of suspending anyone's reaction, including ourselves and our reaction to something, is what allows that story to kind of take shape and decide for itself what needs to be included here and what that universal truth that is emerging is going to end up looking like. Melissa Fabos, which is one of my absolute role models in nonfiction writing, she talks about every time that she has revised a work and looked at the pieces that felt cruel about the people in her life, something that was really personal, she says that almost every time the prose was better off without it. So it may have made it into that first draft, but then by the time the revisions kind of go through their process, it ends up coming out because it wasn't necessary anyway. The real point was somewhere else. And I think there's a real necessary catharsis that needs to happen with that. I think sometimes, writing should never be the way that we process through things, especially if it's intended for the world. But sometimes it is. Sometimes we think we've processed through something and we really just need to write that thing that's vindictive and mean to see it. And then once we've seen it, we're like, oh, that doesn't need to be in there. That piece was just for me. I'm going to take that out. But I think that has been my experience too. I've had experiences where I've been told, this particular part of your writing feels unfair. And my first reaction was, well, that's my experience. How dare you say to me that that's unfair? But then once I sit with it and I look at it and I think about what it would look like to take that out, I see that there's some truth there. We get to be the gods of the page. We get to decide whose story is told, and to only tell one side. Readers see through that. People see through that. So I think that when we're talking ethics, being a fair god of the page is really critical. And I think it's just as beneficial to us as writers to make sure that we're telling both sides and to be really honest about the fact that we are subjective in our telling of something too. And there are ways to work that in that, aren't a disclaimer at the beginning of the book, but there's ways to indicate in your language to say that, this is my perspective, or from my telling, this is how this went down. And then the last thing that I think is a really powerful thing that I've used in my own life, once you have that final version of something before it goes out in the world, before you intend to share it widely, um, give it to the people that are in it and let them read it. And I think people get really scared of this step. I know the first time I did it, I was terrified. Um, but it's important when you're going into that when you give that copy to that person in your life, you're not asking them for permission, and you're not telling them that if they don't like something, you're going to take it out. Even if internally, if they have this strong reaction, you might take that piece out or alter it. Just don't say that. Don't put yourself into that corner. Give them the best version of your work, and they're more likely to feel proud to be in it. And then let them have that reaction. Give them the space. Don't sit with them while they read it. Give them a space. Set a time in the future to talk about it. And in my experience and in, the research that I did for this piece, most of the anticipated reactions that we think are going to be so bad end up not being there. Or it's a weirdly strong reaction about a detail that we never anticipated was going to be the trigger point, So I would say just kind of suspend any assumptions about how a person is going to feel about something and let them have that reaction, and, determine from there, is this worth damaging this relationship, or is this worth, is the truth that I'm sharing more important than this immediate reaction? And it's an annoying thing that it's so subjective and that it's case by case like that. But this is real life, these are real people, and we are just as emotional and human as the people that we're writing about too. So yeah, that was a very long-winded answer to your question.
I once had a chance to sit with a guy I'd worked on a book where this guy's grandfather was a major figure in this book, and he had never known him, but he grew up with a lot of stories, but not very accurate ones necessarily, because this guy hadn't really been there. It's complicated, but basically he wanted to know more, and he had a chance to read about his grandfather in this book I'd worked on, and it was like I get chills thinking about it now, just the look on his face. I've never seen someone so absorbed with something they were reading. And then there's a story of there's a book that it was kind of one of the books that made me fall in love with nonfiction, about a plane crash, and there were it was kind of written collaboratively with 16 survivors, and apparently all 16 of them individually came to the author and were like, you got everybody else exactly right, but you totally missed the mark. You don't get me at all. But they all felt that way, um,
Mhm.
which I think is so classic.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioning that, I have to read this quote from Alexander Chi because I don't think anyone else sums it up better than this. Use the names of neither the willing nor the unwilling, especially those who will change from willing to unwilling once the novel is published and they understand what they have given you. Know that this may be anyone, even you. You do this because you must betray this character in the way all writers betray all of their characters, done to reveal the ways they are human. And I keep that quote visible on my desktop and on my desk because it is so true. And I think even as writers, if someone from that story that you just shared had written the book themselves, they might come back to themselves later and be like, you got this wrong. Because I think once we put something out in the world and we realize like this thing has taken this shape and it wasn't what it was when it lived in our heads, it can feel almost like a betrayal. But it's wild.
And when it is out in the world and there's nothing they can do about it, do you agree with I know she wasn't the first person to say this, but Anne Lamott has like repeated the maxim of basically if people don't like the way you wrote about them, they should have behaved differently.
Oh
Or is
gosh.
that too harsh?
I think it depends on the relationship and the circumstance that you're writing about. Um, I really don't believe that writing and the craft of writing nonfiction should be used to kind of put on display someone's bad behavior and kind of, that vindictive use, the airing the dirty laundry. Like I really kind of veer away from that. So I don't know that I agree with that. But at the same time, I think it depends on the circumstance and writing about a politician who's behaved badly and maybe they dislike that piece once it's out there, then in that case, yes, I think that's an accurate approach. But writing about, a personal relationship or somebody in your life that I don't know, I think we have some kind of we owe something to the people in our lives to make sure that we're getting it right. Um, and I just think it's such a case by case basis. I don't know.
And I think too, circumstances. I mean, like I live in a small rural town. You can't just say anything you want about and have
Yeah.
there not be consequences.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? We as writers, we can write about our lives. We can pull the whole, what is the TV show that's coming out? It's about Capote, I think, and the swans or something. Yeah, I mean, he wrote about these women in his life, and he never asked for permission. He never, tried to make sure that it was okay with them or to, smooth things over or give both sides of the story. And he lived with the consequences. And that's a choice that you make as a writer. I mean, that there are some writers that do that, and that's their choice. And there are some good writers who do that. But for me personally, that's not an approach I'm willing to take for people in my immediate circle, for the people in my life that I want to make sure that I, continue to have a healthy relationship with. Um, in that instance, not everything is fodder for me.
Sure. And who knows, you might want to write about the person again. You might not get that chance if you
Yeah,
scorch the earth the first time.
absolutely.
Um, you brought up you gave me a question to ask other guests, and I'm stealing it. I'm going to use it every time now. Tell me about any like what projects have you shelved and why, and what's your relationship with the writing that hasn't seen the light of day?
Yeah. I have, in the course of my MFA program, I wrote two memoirs, one about my kind of early childhood, and then the other about my time living abroad in South Korea and in Thailand. And neither of them will ever see the light of day, at least in their current form. um, there is a really kind of it's like going through puberty in your writing life, especially for memoirists. I feel like there is a phase when you are first starting out and you're writing this book length work about your own life that is just so cringy and so awkward. Um, and that was both of them. It got a little bit better in the second one for me, but the first one, there is nothing from either of those manuscripts that I will use verbatim. And I think that that's just part of the process of like hearing your own voice on tape kind of thing, of like realizing like, oh gosh, that isn't at all what I was trying to do. And it reminds me a lot of like friends of mine that have written poetry and then years later they read their poetry from like high school and it's just like the worst thing you've ever heard. And, it's kind of that's how I feel about those two manuscripts. So yeah, those are my two shelved projects that will never see the light of day.
Do you feel like you pretty much had to get those out of your system? Like if you hadn't, maybe the cringe would be happening now?
Absolutely. It is a painful but necessary part of the process. I feel so bad for the people in my writing workshops that had to actually read chapters of this and give me constructive feedback. But I'm so grateful for them because that's what led me to realize like, okay, this is not how to approach this. But yeah, I think there is, you have to write it badly first. Um, and then, kill your darlings, as they say, and make it better. But yeah, there is something about like getting that first draft out and just letting it be bad, just let it be terrible, um, and then correct from there. Yeah.
As a ghostwriter, most of the conversations I have about craft are actually with people who have like very little experience writing and in some cases they've never seen unfinished writing. I have to sort of prepare them for what a rough draft looks like because they're hiring me and they're entitled to see the work in an early stage and to give their feedback. One of the things that and I don't know if I have a perfect way of explaining it, but one thing I try to communicate when we're outlining way before anybody touches the keyboard is the difference between like an anecdote or some interesting trivia or a fun fact or a impressive detail and a story. That those are not the same thing. And I think there can be a lot of confusion there that leads to, and I'm talking specifically about memoir. How would if you were helping somebody tell their story in a memoir and they were like an impressive person with an interesting life, but they just there's no story that you can see or it's not there yet. How do you get from, that's interesting to a irresistible story that's going to keep people reading for 200 pages?
Yeah. I think what you just described is kind of a challenge that writers writing their own memoirs face as well, because we have all these little nuggets that we think are so equally important that just have to make it in, and they are not interesting to anybody but us. And I guess one of the ways that I combat that for myself, and that maybe would be applicable to a client or to someone that you're kind of talking through how to get the story length kind of arc. Um, don't resist those nuggets, still bring them in, but start to categorize them by theme and see if there's a story there. If you keep bringing up these kind of vignettes in your life, but they all are alluding to this power dynamic between, people in this person's life, then maybe there's something to that kind of ties into the overall story that you're telling about a person's life. Or if the little kind of one-off stories and anecdotes all seem to tie into, you know, this childhood event that keeps recurring in this person's life, then there's a story there. I I think that inevitably not all of the anecdotes could make it in, right? There's just no way. But sometimes there is something, if it's important and it's recurring, and there's a sense of urgency about, I don't know how this fits in, but I want to make sure it's here. There's probably something to that. There's probably something underlying that does have a story to it. Um, that's just kind of my hunch. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've noticed is where people get into trouble is maybe they think they have a story on their hands because there's something in it for them that's emotionally resonant. And then they have this series of anecdotes that they've kind of strung together. And but all it's just a pile of vignettes. What's going on there? And maybe how do you kind of diagnose that and address it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that sometimes that behavior is a dodge to kind of avoid talking about the real story and talking about the real thing, um, and kind of focusing in on this short, sweet anecdote that we can sum up and say, this is an interesting thing that happened to me in my life. is not getting to the root of the story or the root of the thing that the person really needs to be talking about. Um, and, that example of like, I met a famous person. Okay, great. What does that have to do with the overall arc of your life story or of this story that we're focusing on? Where were you in your life when you were meeting this person? Why did it mean so much to you? Or was it an embarrassing experience for you? And why was that the case? And kind of coming back to the root of where that person was in their life and why they feel the need to bring up these short, sweet little like snappy stories that they think are more interesting, when in reality there might be a more interior story that's happening that is the more interesting story, but they're avoidant to go there and they don't really want to go there. And even as writers, I think we're more likely to tell the like cool story that we think people want to hear, or that, sounds like it would make it into a movie, but it isn't the thing that people actually want to hear from us, or it's not the thing that is underlying the real story of our lives or the real universal truth that we need to be getting to. So some of those flashy things and those little anecdotes are just kind of noise, and just kind of like, look over here, look over here. Don't look at this real thing that's happening in my life that is really big. And yeah, as a ghostwriter, you kind of have to field that and be like, okay, this person's throwing a lot at me and not all of it is meaningful. What's the underlying thing here that maybe they're avoiding or that they don't want to talk about? And maybe that's the real story. Yeah.
What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah. I have really just loved the form of essay writing, and I really kind of fallen into that. So I continue to work on kind of essay approaches to some of these things that I've written about in my memoir, and my memoirs, and kind of pulling that into, for me, essay is such a it's a way to make it more relatable to more people and to have a greater impact, and to kind of, there's so many different forms of essay that you can do. Not to say that memoir doesn't have many different forms as well, because it does. But for me, or essay writing is the most direct way for me to get at that kind of universal truth that I'm trying to convey about something that's happened in my life, rather than me just trying to give an account of the thing that happened itself. Um, and it's a way for me to kind of bring in other perspectives as well. Um, so I'm working on, kind of collecting some of the essays that I've written over the past 3 or 4 years, and potentially putting those together into a book length work. It's not the most popular first publication to have. It's a very difficult first publication to get, but it's, one that I feel really, really strongly about.
Nice. Well, I look forward to hearing where that takes you. Where can listeners find you?
Yeah, Instagram is my most active platform for my writing content. So at Greene Pen, Greene spelled with an E, always. And yeah, I link all of my written work there as well.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlie. This is great.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Rachel's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.